Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Today we have Doug Hoffer, who is our state auditor since 2013. Welcome to the show, first
Thank
time.
you very much. Yeah.
And Ben Kinsley,
Thank
who
you.
is a co-host and co-producer. So we always ask our guests to say a little bit about their background and why in heaven's name you were interested in running for state auditor.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
A very good question in particular, because for many years, you may recall, I was vocal about some public policy issues
Yes.
that were in my little corner of the world. And reporters knew that if they called me and kept me on the phone long enough, I would say something provocative. Because at the end, I would say, I don't care, I'm not running for anything.
Ta-da.
They could always get a headline out.
Yeah.
I actually think you had a few people worried about that style before you became auditor.
I know they were.
Yeah, I know.
No question. But they weren't paying attention to the work, which they should have. In any case, how far back do you want to go?
Well, wherever you
I
want to
don't
go.
know.
I told you I worked for Alex Acebo, so we go back a ways.
20 years plus. What can I say? I quit high school in '67 because I was bored. My family moved from Connecticut to Florida, where the schools were terrible. It was also 1967. There were other things to do.
Doing other things in the 60s.
So I took 12 years off, worked and traveled, and went back to college after a stint, among other things, as the maitre d' at Alice's restaurant in the Berkshires. And 1980, at age 30, I went to Williams College, which was a great experience. They have tremendous resources, tremendous faculty. I'm sure you know something about Williams. In any case, thanks to a meeting of a speaker at Williams, Catherine McKinnon, who was a preeminent feminist legal scholar of her time, I was disappointed in the law schools that I was investigating, not that I wanted to practice, and I said, I don't know what to do. I drove her to the airport for a couple hours. She said, go to SUNY Buffalo. I said, who knew? Because I was looking at Yale and Michigan and top schools. She said, that's where they have all the critical legal studies people. And I said, what's that? She said, they have a different approach to the law and to teaching the law, and it was great. And for me, it was perfect because since I didn't want to practice, my second and third year, I could take courses that were fun, whereas everybody else was taking courses to prepare for the bar exam, which is no fun at all. Right. So I didn't want to practice. I wanted to do public policy, which was an interest all my life. So in my third year in law school, I applied for one job, and that was at CEDO in City Hall in Burlington when Bernie was mayor and Peter Clavel was the head of CEDO. And luckily, I got the job and came to Vermont. I've been here for 30 years.
There's a triumvirate there, the three of you.
That was fun.
Wow.
We did good work. Bernie and Peter certainly expanded the discourse and allowed you to talk about different policies. They didn't win them all, but they got the ball rolling. So when Peter Clavel lost to Peter Brownell in '93, I left CEDO and went out on my own and tried to piece together some work, which is not easy for a policy wonk in Vermont, in a small state. So two things happened pretty quickly, fortunately. One was I had met Ellen Kaler, who was then a very young woman and was the new director of the Peace and Justice Center at that time. And she had all the energy in the world. She's now the head of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. And she was interested in, as were a couple of other people I knew, Jane Nodell was an economist at UVM, and Phil Fermonti, who worked for Bernie, in doing what became known as the Job Gap Study. And we met at Nectar's, in fact, in downtown Burlington, in the back booth, and they said, well, they talked about it and said, we really should do that. Who's going to do it? Let's have Doug do it. So, 10 years later and 10 phases later. So that was a nice base for my consultancy. And then within months, I got a call from Ed Flanagan, who was then the state auditor, had been for a couple of years, and he wanted me to come down here and work, and I said, I don't want to commute to Montpelier, here I am, but I'll be happy to do some contract work for you. And what he wanted to do was fascinating, and we discussed this very briefly before. He was thinking about what we now take for granted, which is performance auditing. And I didn't know anything about it, neither did he, but we stumbled into it, and I think we did some good work, and that exposed me both to the nuts and bolts of state government and also to Ed. And and those two things, the Peace and Justice Center's job gap study work and the work for Ed, gave me a nice foundation. So that was good. As to how I came to this job, I had been doing it for 19 years on my own, working alone. And there was an opportunity. Tom Salmon, my predecessor, was there, and I thought, I can do that, and I can do it better than he can. And the people didn't think so the first time. But second time worked, and here I am.
Good, that's great. Well, I was looking, when you were self-employed, you had an impressive list of clients, which really almost set you up for the next step, which would be the auditor, because you had the Peace and Justice Center, there's Treasurer's Department, of VSEA, we all know VSEA, and obviously the city of Burlington, so you had quite a client list.
It was fun. I liked and respected all my clients, which not everybody can say who's an independent consultant. The work I did for VSEA was interesting because they were in negotiations and needed
Mm-hmm.
some numbers crunched. The work I did for then Treasurer Jeb Spalding related
right.
to what is referred to as economically targeted investments, which I think is important for any treasurer who has a large amount of public funds, in our case almost $4 billion, with almost none of it invested here, which isn't to say that's a bad thing. They want to get a good return, and we don't have a lot of Fortune 500 companies
Right.
here, but
That is
nevertheless, other places do it. New York, California, it's done all over the country. So that was the work I did for him. The city of Burlington was interesting because I was a commissioner of the Burlington Electric Department for 6 years in the 90s.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And 5 years as chair, and worked with some people you probably know, Gene O'Sullivan and Karen Paul and
Sure.
David Zuckerman, and it was a good crew. And Barb Grimes became,
Oh,
we
Barb.
hired Barb
Yeah,
to be
right.
the GM.
Did you?
While I was
Yeah,
there. and
she's
She
great.
was crackerjack. But towards the end of my tenure, they had never done an annual performance report for the department, for the people, of the ratepayers and the citizens of Burlington. And I loved the numbers, so I did it as chair. And when I left the commission after 6 years, because I'm not Edie Amin, I wasn't going to serve for life, Barb hired me to do it. And I didn't charge a lot, but so that was a good gig too. I like
That's
that.
great. You've got a great circle you've been hanging around with.
Good people.
Good
indeed.
for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it sounds like a lot of the work you did as a contractor kind of flowed into what you do as auditor. Can you explain what the auditor's office does in Vermont?
Indeed, good
Yeah.
question. And even through the campaigns, not that I'm a huge campaigner, but a lot of people don't know the office.
Right.
And that's, I think, understandable. The office has three primary responsibilities. The first is the audit of the annual financial report that Finance and Management puts together, which is a very big deal. It's very time-consuming, and we hire an outside firm to do that. The CAFR is what it's called, and Wall Street loves that. You got to have a clean opinion on the CAFR, which means that you know how to manage the money.
Right.
Practically. Not that you're making good choices in the nature of policy, but that you can demonstrate that, yes, we collected this is how we spent it, this is our net assets, and so forth.
Right. You're
That's-
following the budget and you're spending it and you're allocating it
Actually, it's
correctly.
different than the budget. The budget is predictive,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
The CAFR is after the fact.
Right.
looking
So you go back and look. Here's
Right.
how you did.
Exactly.
The budget's the plan, and then
Right.
it's the after the fact figuring out how you
Exactly. And the second big one is called the Federal Single Audit, the A133, which is mandated by the Office of Management and Budget. Every state has to do it, and some cities. If you receive federal money, there are always strings attached. I don't mean to call them strings, but there are requirements, both statutory and regulatory, that if you get, $1 billion for Medicaid, there are rules. How do you determine eligibility and so forth? And that's what that job does, is go back in and look and see if, in fact, the state is following the rules.
So is it just federal dollars and that's why it's called single audit,
Right.
or, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Is that? I'm sorry, not to interrupt you, but
No,
does that
that's
make a little more complicated in Vermont's case because of the global commitment waiver? Does that make it more complicated, or
I
is it
don't
not
think
really?
it's more complicated. It's complicated.
Right.
And in fact, I think it's appropriate that the office doesn't do that anymore. The CAFR, you just need people who are financial auditors. I don't mean to diminish their skills, but the single audit requires a crew to keep up with the ever-changing federal requirements. And they do change all the time, not just about how to do it, but all those departments and programs. It could be the Health and Human Services flowing money into our AHS. It could be money from the Department of Justice. They're everywhere, education. And you have to know what the requirements are. So I'm just as happy that they don't do that. In fact, back to your question, because starting with Ed, slowly, and then through Liz Reedy and Randy Brock and Tom as well, the office moved away from contributing in-house staff time to those two audits and moved now totally to performance auditing. And if that was not the case, I would not have wanted this job. Because the performance auditing, to me, is the fun part.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it seems
I
like that
think
is the
so.
more interesting part.
Yeah,
and that's the third one, is the
Right,
performance
exactly.
auditing, is the third.
And there's a lot of attention in the legislature and in the administration to performance, which I think
Indeed.
helps.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you're the only one out there talking performance, then
Right.
don't respond too quick. Do you get into the nitty-gritty of a single employee could have 3 or 4 federal sources of funds for their job? Because I remember working in a department which shall be unnamed. A lot of the employees had several sources of federal dollars. You get it when the single auditors, you get down to that level
They sometimes have no choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do a bunch of audits. There's a whole bunch that your office handles on an annual basis. Can you walk through some of those for us?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by a whole bunch, but
There's a whole list on your website.
let me give you one piece of background information. The professional audit staff in the office, they are funded by what's called the Single Audit Revolving Fund. And I'm sure you remember that's an internal service fund that is charged based on a formula that's approved both by Finance and Management and the federal government to all the departments and agencies. And it's based for the CAFR on their percentage of the total budget. For the A133, it's a mix of both revenues from the feds and expenditures, a little of both. So in order to do GAGAS standard audit, government auditing standards, that's the only way we can get the SARF money. So there's no shortcuts on audits. They're time consuming. When you see a 40-page report, there's 400 pages of work papers behind that. I'm very happy and comfortable to present the results of the work that the staff does because I know there's not a word in that document that 3 people haven't checked. It's really quite remarkable. It's fun. I mean, I used to do that on my own work, but my reports weren't quite as lengthy or complicated as theirs. So anyway, we do somewhere between 4 and 6 or more a year. The simple ones take 4 to 5 months, and the complicated ones take 8 to 10 months. There's just no way around it. Complications come from maybe multiple departments or agencies that you're reviewing or their work, time frame, number of staff devoted. It's not uncommon for us to end up in a department when they're in the middle of something. For example, we're now in our second audit of the tax department, and they've been rolling out new software for 2 or 3 years now. They devote their staff to that. That's their priority. We got to wait. It goes on and on. But we've done maybe 2 dozen or so since I've been there. We also do some non-audit inquiries. There were 4 exempt positions in the office. The rest are all classified. One of them, under my predecessor, was a PR person. I repurposed that position into a researcher. And there's 2 of them I've had in the 5 years, and they do very rigorous and detailed research, but it doesn't meet GAGA standards, which typically means we can get more product out. But I love that work, and that work has been some of the really fun stuff. The ski area leases of public lands was that one.
Right.
Sole source contracting was that one, and healthcare pricing transparency was a non-audit inquiry. So
All important issues.
yeah, to me, real important. Yeah.
Yeah, those sole source contracting has been an issue since forever.
Well, and I think the thing with that is everyone knew that there were problems with the process. I think your report really highlighted what they are and said, yeah, there's problems and here's what we can do about it.
It was impossible to say what the cost of the extent of sole source contracting was to the state. You just never know. If 40% of the contracts in those large entities were sole source, there's no way to go back and say, if we had bid those jobs, how much could we have saved?
Right.
But I think most people would agree there are some savings we left on the table.
Well, and I know talking with in-state contractors, anecdotally, and this is hard to measure, but a lot of the contracts, even if they are competitively bid, are written in such a way that they favor a certain contractor. And that's anecdotally something that I've heard around Montpelier. That's something that's really hard to measure.
I've heard that as well, and it is impossible to measure unless you dig in a level of detail that we typically can't in an audit. But I've heard that as well. But we didn't go that deep in the audit we did.
So what changes did you make in the single and sole search? Did you put in any recommendations? We
did, and in fact, the administration, I think, has revised Bulletin 3.5, as it's called, which is the guidance for state government on contracting. Made some changes in that regard. Really, the bottom line is the first line of defense are the commissioners and secretaries who, when their staff come up to them with a request, there is a requirement that a memo be written to the 5th floor, the administration, that justifies your request for a sole source if it's above a certain amount. You know, those commissioners and secretaries, they're the first line of defense. They have to say, this doesn't really work for me. You know, sometimes it can.
Because sometimes you don't want to rock the boat. You've got the person on board, they know everything, and just makes sense instead of stopping and training and retraining.
That's true, and that's their justification often. But once that's done, if the commissioner signs off on it and it goes up to the Secretary of Administration, they have to sign off on it. We found that over time, the 5th floor was being rather generous.
Right, just signing off.
So there are several steps, and we just pointed that out, and what we can do is go back later and see if there's been a significant change.
Right, yeah, in terms of practices.
Check your numbers on those, Ben.
And we do that all the time, by the way. I noticed you had a question that we talked about in our email exchange. After the fact, That used to be 2 and 4 years, now it's 1 and 3 years. We go back to the departments that have been audited and determine if in fact they have adopted our recommendation. It's called recommendation follow-up.
I think the question was, what kind of authority do you have? Exactly. You can recommend, but at some point, if they don't follow it, what's your recourse?
Like the Pope, I have no allegiance.
Oh, I see.
So, if
Because
we,
in business, if you have an audit and they bring back an unsuccessful management note or whatever they call it, you want to make sure by the next year you've got that fixed, because you don't want it going on, because your stockholders, shareholders, and the public, if it's a municipality, they get pretty upset if they see the audit. But we don't do that here?
well, we are trying as best we can to take the recommendations to the committees of jurisdiction in the legislature in the first
that's
instance
a good way.
and educate them when the audit first comes out. They're all busy during the session.
Right.
Sometimes their reports come out off cycle. Furthermore, they don't necessarily have the power to change it themselves. If it's an administrative thing, they're not going to
Right.
cut a budget just because somebody needs to make improvements. But the other recommendations that there's a little leverage on are the ones in the A133, the federal single audit. Because according to the rules, the federal rules, if they find that you are out of compliance with one of your many, many requirements, maybe it's eligibility, maybe it's just paperwork, it could be relatively minor, but if it's material, then the rules say, we have a finding against you this year that requires us to do another audit of that same program next year, even if it wasn't going to be on the list.
Well,
That
that's
costs
good.
35 or 40 grand. Boom, just like that.
Right.
Not from us, but from our contractor. And finance and management, understandably, doesn't like that. Some departments appreciate that that's a lot of money. Some of them argue about, well, it shouldn't be a finding, and there are rules. And for the audit team that we hire to sign that audit, because I don't sign it, they do,
Right.
they have to meet GAGAS and GAP standards. And they say, look, the rules say this, you didn't do it. I have to call you out on this. Anyway, so it's a back and forth, but there's a little leverage because of the money. But on the recommendations, if we identify savings or potential cost recovery, that usually gets people's attention.
Right. I'm glad to hear you have a little something, because there are areas that should be changed, perhaps. Just
One of the things
paying
actually that just occurred to me, is there any, because I follow the budget process fairly closly in the legislature, and
You must be great at parties, then.
oh,
It's a
it's
real
lovely.
icebreaker.
Yeah. But something you don't hear from a lot is what was your performance audit for your department, right? When you're asking for a budget increase or whatever. So how do we know that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing now?
Right.
And that's something that's not really asked.
Some departments, for many years, have done a better job than others. It's interesting you mention that, because not only do I care a lot about that, but that's one of the jobs I did for Ed Flanagan back in the 90s for
Yeah,
the
he
first
actually
time.
was one of the first people that started this discussion.
And the legislature adopted a couple of approaches to this. The governor didn't like it too much at the time, but we did the work, and it was new then. And the problem was that the administration had to take ownership of that and give
Right.
people some training and really get behind it. And they haven't really done that in the last 20 years, which is too bad. Nevertheless, there are always some people, like Con Hogan, when he was at Corrections and at Human
Yeah.
Services, he's a numbers guy. He liked that. So some people do a good job who have access to the relevant data. Other departments, it's harder to measure. I've always been frustrated with the Agency of Commerce, but that, in all fairness, is a hard one to measure. You do 6 different things, six different programs. Who can say whether your program or that program made a difference or
Right.
not? Or maybe it would have happened anyway.
Or maybe they collectively made a difference, and
Furthermore.
none of them individually would have done
Right.
it.
And furthermore, in programs or departments that do prevention, how can you, with any confidence, say to the legislature, there were 18 fewer fires
Right.
because of what you can't do. So
Right.
it's challenging, but it has to be
Well,
done.
and I think employees you have to train them how to think about setting it, because I think most people go for, well, we produced 1,000 widgets. Well, is that good or bad?
Those
As
are
opposed to-
outputs
Yes,
as
opposed, so that it's a whole training process,
Yeah,
I think, for
it is.
employees to get it. to-
Well,
to
and I
set
think,
them.
we're one of the things that we've paid a lot of attention to on this show is the mental health crisis and the opiate crisis that our state is facing. And those are really hard things to measure. You can measure treatment numbers, but you can't, like you said, measure prevention.
No.
And that's really what you have to
Right.
do, is focus on prevention, because once someone has a substance abuse problem or a mental health problem, it's a lot more difficult to treat them on the back end than
It's
it
a
does on the front end.
multi-year measurement
Right.
issue at that point, and you have to be patient. There's no way around it. You have to commit to some responses to the crisis. Say, we think this is best practice for the following reasons. We're going to commit the money and the time, and we'll check it year to year, but we may not see it in 3 to 5 years.
Right.
So your function, do you roll up your sleeves and do some of these? The
I
ones
do
that you
sometimes
really-
roll up
do
my
you?
sleeves, yes.
I mean, are you really into the weeds with your staff sometimes?
To this
or more,
extent.
More, management?
Well, the audit staff, under an audit manager, each project has an audit manager, and we have 2 very senior and extremely capable people that I inherited, and I'm grateful for them, Tanya and Linda, and they put together teams for each audit.
Great.
My deputy and I are very involved in every one of them through our weekly meetings with
great.
those 2 senior staff. We know what's going on week to week. We have a lot of input on the final product. My deputy, among many other skills, she was an economist in the tax department, was a professional editor. So
Oh,
that drives them
perfect.
crazy because she really gets the comments and everything. But we
It's like
both,
my wife. She does that too.
we both, I think, add considerable value on that level. And it's kind of interesting, without commenting on Tanya and Linda's writing skills, but auditors generally didn't come through the same sort of humanities-based liberal arts education
It's all numbers,
that many
right?
other, exactly.
Right.
And, financial audits
Right.
are pretty boilerplate. And this work requires a different kind of writing. So the more eyes, the better. It takes a little bit longer, but I think we get a better product. But to answer your question, I'm not with the team
Yeah.
on the audit work, but I'm very involved in every
That's
project.
great.
Yeah.
How many staff do you have
We
there?
have 10 professional auditors.
Oh, excellent.
Myself, my deputy, receptionist, assistant, business manager, and the one fellow I mentioned who does non-audit.
And you said you had
inquiries.
3 exempts, right? Which
Four.
gives you
Myself, my
gives you the
deputy.
flexibility to bring folks in.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. So I saw on your website one of my favorite words, strategic plans. I'm big on that. And you had 2017, 2016 performance reports, how you did last year, and then what you're going to do this year. And this is something you look at every year.
I do it in December and get
Yeah.
it ready for January.
And I guess who sets what you're going to do? It's in the legislature. Do they say we want audit to look at DMV? We'll pick on DMV. Or do you decide because of things you've heard or suspect or whatever that they need an audit?
That's a very good question, and the answer is there are a number of points along the way. Some of them, they're literally ripped from the headlines. VHC, the Health Connect.
Yeah.
It was a train wreck, and there was no way that my office could avoid taking a good look at it. We did 2 of them. It's complicated, but it's Medicaid related, and we have someone in the office who's done a lot of work in that area. Rarely do they ask us specifically, and I'm glad they don't. And I ask each year, I ask the speaker and the pro tem, go easy on us because you guys don't know how to write objectives. If you have a broad interest, then let's have a conversation about how we can help you.
Right.
But don't tell us exactly what to do. They've done that twice. Once was with TIFs, the Municipal Tax Increment Financing.
TIF, right.
Now, that was mostly just before I got there, and it took an enormous amount of time.
Yeah, they spent a whole lot of energy on that.
God,
Yeah.
yeah, and now that it's, once all those reports came out, the legislature said, my God, this is a mess, we have to clean this up. They did. VEPC, which has a role to play, the Economic Progress Council in the legislature and our office, they now have new rules, so we're kind of starting from zero. We're just starting the first audit under the new regime in Milton, and we have to do 1 or 2 a year for the next 5 years. The other one was the Sex Offender Registry, which was the result of a bit of a tiff between a House member and a Senate member, one of whom wanted to put sex offender addresses, specific addresses, not just their town, online. And the other one said, I'm not so sure that's a good idea. We had to do, over time, 2 audits of that process. And the person in my office who had to read those files deserved,
Exactly. I can't
extra
imagine.
pay.
Yeah.
It was terrible. But to answer your question, the other is that the staff sometimes make suggestions. The decision ultimately is mine. I make suggestions, my deputy. We hear it from people on the street. Everybody's got an idea about something they want audited. You can't do everything. We only do 4 or 6 or so a year.
Right.
So there's a limit. And it's a big state government.
And these are the ones that you have discretion over. There are some that you have to do.
Well,
that are-
the A133, the single audit, and the CAFR have to be done
Have to be
by
done.
law.
Yeah.
But as far as performance auditing, it's entirely up to me.
Right.
Now, technically, the governor can ask me, but the governor never has.
And it's got to be interesting too, because I'm sure you also get audit ideas from previous audits that you've done. Like you've done two audits on Vermont Health Connect. I'm not sure if you went in knowing you were going to do 2 audits and realized at some point that there's 2 different lines of investigation.
There are multiple
here.
lines always,
Right.
and you have to narrow the objectives, or your audit will take 2 years.
Right.
And cost $500 million. But no, it's funny you say that, because we did a job on BGS recently, Buildings and General Services, about capital projects and their management
saw
of those
that,
projects.
right.
And in the course of that, Tanya, who was leading the team, was scrutinizing the capital bill that she had to do for the job, and came across a reference to some monies that were going from the capital bill to the Department, or now Agency of Agriculture, for a program called Best Management Practices, and they were making grants to farmers to make changes on their land that were intended to reduce runoff of phosphorus and other things, and to do water quality improvements. And I thought, that's curious. It's rare
Much tied to BGS.
to
Right.
find this. Yeah, when furthermore, typically capital funds are spent on public
Right.
property,
Tangible
not
funds,
private
right.
property. And furthermore, you don't usually see taxpayers paying polluters to clean up.
Good
If you
observation.
were a dry cleaner in the old days and were putting mercury into Burlington Bay,
Right.
taxpayers wouldn't be expected to pay for you to clean that up. Now, in
Right.
fact, that's the world as we know it, because they're out of business and go on Superfund sites and all that jazz. But in this case, it was curious, and that's what we learned. And I said, I want to look into that. So we're doing an audit of that right
Wow.
now.
Well, especially, I mean, we do subsidize farmers quite a bit in certain areas, things like current use and what they are being subsidized essentially.
And many
by-
of them, I think it's fair and justifiable. This one caught my eye.
Right, because
Yeah.
it says capital.
Because
That's
it's
the key.
yeah, that's very curious, and I think another area where I've heard anecdotal things about single bid contracts.
Who
and
is this you're
whatnot.
talking to?
I talk to lots of people,
talk
but
later.
Building and General Services is one of them where you see a lot of that type of
Well, the good news is, you haven't asked this, but you would eventually. What happens when we send the final draft of the report to the auditee? You're the commissioner of
Right,
Department X.
right.
You have 2 weeks. After an exit conference where we have a back and forth about, did we make any factual errors? Is there anything we missed? Because we don't want to do that. Then when we're done, we give it to you. You have 2 weeks to write a management response,
Right.
which is included as an appendix in the report, as it should be. And you get a mix of responses from different departments. And I like the ones, like Chris Cole, who's the new commissioner at BGS,
Right, BGS, yeah.
who, in response to this report, which really identified a number of areas where they needed to improve. Now, he had come over from AOT. He was comfortable with modern systems for
Right.
managing large projects, and he was, I think, already moving down that road. But the report gave him a little more ammunition with his staff and others to say, I want this done. Even the auditor says we need to do
Right.
this. So he basically said what you like to hear from a commissioner or secretary. Thanks for the good work. We appreciate the recommendations, and we're going to get right on it.
Good.
Yeah.
Well,
But
Chris
you
is
don't-
a
you
good
don't
guy.
always get that.
No,
Yeah.
Chris is a good guy.
if you could categorize the variety of responses that you get from
Some are defensive.
from thank you, this is good information, to
I've always
go
looked at it
take
as
a
a help.
swim.
I mean, I always invited ACEBO and come on in, because if there's something wrong, if it blows up, I'm going to be the one that's going to get hit in the face, so let's
Right.
fix it now.
No manager wants to have a report come out to talk about problems on
Right.
your watch.
Yeah, but you fix it.
But what manager doesn't want to get better at
Right,
what they do?
right.
Now, I can appreciate that it's sensitive. If you've got employees who, never by name, but their work is being criticized as being subpar, there's a lot of room for improvement or whatever, that's painful.
Right.
Nobody likes that, but it goes with the turf. You can't avoid
But
it.
it's actually for their defense or for their protection, because if you don't have that, that system set up where you're not holding, where not one person is writing the check, cashing the check,
Right.
and whatever, you're protecting the employee too, and I think they would understand that.
Great example of that would have been the EB5. If someone
hold on.
had raised a hand sooner,
comes later, that
I know, but if someone had raised a hand
Yeah,
before it
okay.
got to the point that it got to,
Yeah,
I mean, look, how much grief could you have avoided?
Well, some outsiders did raise their hand, as you know.
And no one listened.
And the interesting thing is, for me, because I was aware of what was going on before I was elected in all those years, I came from CEDO, Community and Economic Development Office in Burlington, and I didn't get there till '88, but in the years prior, when CEDO was created, in the early tenure
Yeah,
of Bernie's
that's right.
mayoralty by Peter Clavelle, they understood that they couldn't really be advocates and be part of the planning and zoning office, which had regulatory responsibilities. So they said, well, let's separate these. And we can have an office, because it was an entitlement city and got money directly from HUD. So they could do more than advocate. They could fund things and have a process. They understood that you can't do both. And from the very beginning, the state of Vermont missed that completely, which is a little disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think,
It's
and we
pretty
talked about
scary.
this before on the show, and part of the issue, I think, with the EB5 Regional Center, first is the only one that was run by a state government,
Right.
but it was also one of the first ones ever set up.
Yeah.
So I think they were just figuring it out
No
when they were
question.
doing it.
But what's
And,
sad is there are a few smaller ones that are really working well, like
Mm-hmm.
up at Sugar Bush, and there's some in Stowe has one.
Mount
And
Snow,
I mean,
yeah.
they're working well because they're manageable. They're a nice size, I think. That's
This one, you know, when they had the press conference and said, whatever it was, $400 million in Newport, and everybody, you know, kept a straight face,
Right.
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah.
It's Newport.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to tell you, on the calendar, you listed your performance reports and you had 3 goals. And it looked to me, and this is, you'll have to correct me, that there are 3 types of audits. One is audits and reviews that promote government accountability, improve efficiency and effectiveness. The second one is financial audits on schedule. And the third are non-audit services. Could you just quickly, you may have already gone, but just what do those 3
Well, the
categories?
second one that you mentioned is the CAFR.
The CAFR, oh, okay.
That's the big,
Okay.
the audit
And
of
the
the
single
financial
audit.
statements. And the single audit is a compliance audit technically, but they're in that category.
Okay.
The first one, the performance audits, are the ones that you see on the website
Yeah.
under performance audit, that category. And there's, as I said, 4 to 6 a year, thereabouts. The non-audit services can take many forms, but as I mentioned, some of the ones that you know about, the report on ski area leases of public lands,
So they're the
sole source
miscellaneous
contracting.
sort of
Right.
things, okay, all right. I have to tell you, if you go on the website, there are years of these audit reports, and each one has a link. Press on it, and there it is. It's a really great website.
Well, thank you. And
Seriously.
not only that, I mentioned recommendation follow-up.
Yep.
Each time we do that, and we do it twice for each one, we go out a year after and then 2 years later, there is another link below the report itself that will take you to the recommendation follow-up, and you can say, well, okay, I just read the
Did they-
report and we knew there were 7 recommendations. Did the department adopt those recommendations? And if not, why not?
Interesting.
I'm glad that you do that because that's a really great thing to say. Because so many times a report gets put out by state government, a legislature, and nothing
the shelf,
happens.
right.
Yeah, nothing happens.
I've written a few of those.
But
Spend all summer, and they, no, I didn't read it. Explain it to me.
yeah, exactly.
You can't put it
Really?
on a page and a half.
Exactly.
But I'm
Forget
glad that you go back and check and say, hey, where are we with the 7 or whatever recommendations that we
Well,
made?
that's good practice.
It is. I think it's good practice, and it also engages the departments and agencies maybe a little bit more.
We're going to try, as I mentioned, we're trying to be a little more assertive without being rude and draw attention in the committees of jurisdiction up front, so they have time, if they want to call those folks in and say, look, they said this, you didn't do it, what's going on? Otherwise, because back to your question, what leverage do I have?
Right.
Legally, none. We tried to persuade people with reason and logic and evidence-based findings. Beyond that, all we can do is say, hey, remember?
Yeah.
Right. That's
Well,
too
and I think
bad.
that's where, quite honestly, advocacy groups like Campaign for Vermont and others can do a little bit better of a job. I think probably going back and saying, hey, did you guys comply with the
Well, the more the merrier. I
recommendations?
mean, when I was a consultant, and often in the legislature I didn't have a client. I would just go down because a committee chair said, hey, I'd like to hear from you. So I'd go down and I'd talk, and sometimes people were quite interested because they'd say, I never heard that. Well, that's because the other lobbyists never told you that. But when I left, the circle would close because there weren't a bunch of advocacy groups behind me
Right.
Right.
of any
That's
stripe,
right.
whether they, in many states, focusing on the issues I cared about, it would have been organized labor and some others. But they're not there.
Right.
So to the extent that nonprofits and groups of any kind, every kind, can focus on these things, some of this stuff, there are groups that deal with the environment and housing and so forth, but there are some orphan things that there's no balance, like
Right.
economic development.
Yeah, right. Well, We've never done that correctly, I don't think. We don't put enough money into it, and that's another
Well,
show.
you don't figure. Yeah, that's what you can do a whole
That's
show
a whole
just on
show.
that.
It gets me so
I don't know if
upset.
it's the amount of money, but the way it's used.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know,
So.
you've got my vote on that one, so
Yeah.
I don't understand. It's been years.
Well, it's interesting. We were talking about this a little bit a few minutes ago, but you do some work with whistleblowers and complaints and inquiries, both from state workers as well as from people outside of state government.
We do, and actually my assistant fields most of those, and he does a good job, but a reasonable percentage of them are people who call out of anger and saying, I saw Mary who's on food stamps at the bar,
Oh.
and she's driving a nice car, and they're angry about something.
Right.
They don't understand that you can have an asset and no income and still be eligible for the thing. So AHS, Human Services, has a crew that deals with that. We did an audit of that function as well, but we send those to them. The other ones cover the waterfront, and they're about schools and school districts and school boards, and almost any issue you can think of, we get calls.
How would you get involved in a whistleblower if somebody was fired for whistleblowing? Would you go in and was that an HR thing, or is that comes under your?
That's a good point. If there is an element of the complaint that is related to a personnel matter
Yeah.
directly, I'm not going to substitute my judgment or put my staff onto a job that is appropriately that of HR. Having said that, if somebody comes to me and says something's happening in my office and I'm very concerned about retaliation, and I can say, fine, tell them you've spoken to me if you want to be known. You want it to be known, because if they know I'm paying attention, they're probably going to be less likely to give
Right,
you a hard time.
right.
Now, having said that, I can't judge whatever is the core of their complaint or problem within the office. A good example is led to an audit that we're conducting right now. We heard from some staffers, some now former staffers at the tax department about some issues they were concerned about in the department, but there was also a personnel element to it. And I said, look, I'm happy to talk with you about the substantive issues, but the personnel stuff,
Right.
I don't have the wherewithal, and frankly, I don't think it's appropriate for me to substitute my judgment for HR. There's a process, there's a contract, and so forth. And they said, great, but the substantive issue led us to begin an audit that we're conducting. So, and it's the second one that came from a whistleblower. So they can be helpful. And
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised that I haven't had more about hardcore problems in the departments, which may be because there aren't as many as people might think.
Well, I noticed once again on your excellent website that a lot of the departments out there, they have a fraud contact person. So maybe they go to Human Services, and then it would filter up to you, perhaps, I don't know. But every one of those departments out there seems to have a fraud line that you would call.
Correct.
It's really a great.
Well, and
fun
the
to
other
read.
thing too, I think, some employees may be worried about retaliation and don't want to reach out to anyone because they're afraid of retaliation. That's a possibility.
I know that's real for some people.
Yeah.
It's easy to say,
Because
stand
you know
up.
what, it happens.
It's
The
another
other
one of
thing
those.
is you've got a job, you've got a
Yeah.
family,
And you got to prioritize your family and your job over,
Right.
and that's an understandable decision for people to make.
However, shortly after I came to work in this job, it was clear to me that there were a number of people in the state workforce that were concerned about retaliation. So I went to the legislature and I said, look, as it stands, and I verified this with the Attorney General's office, if you came to me and said as a public records request, I want the names of all the people that have come to you as whistleblowers, I would have had to give you that list.
Really?
So I went to the legislature and I said,
That sort of
this,
defeats the purpose.
yes,
Right.
this doesn't work.
Right.
So they gave me the authority. Technically, what they did is make an exemption. Not everybody likes this, an exception, I should say, in the public records law that says, if I'm asked, I don't have to give information that would identify that person
Right.
unless they agree or unless the matter is fully resolved. So
Right.
Good.
And so, do you feel like there's enough protections for whistleblowers under the current status of laws in Vermont, or do you feel like there needs to be more protections for whistleblowers?
it's hard to say. Some of it's anecdotal, but my guess is no. There's not.
I would agree. I think if somebody wants you gone,
Yeah.
Yeah.
they'd come up with something that you couldn't tie back to the whistleblowing.
Well, and even
Right.
even
do it.
anonymous, like anonymous tip lines and stuff like that, which are great concepts because it kind of removes that barrier. But in Vermont, where you have departments that are as small as they are, that information can only come from one of
Yeah,
a couple
right.
people,
Indeed.
and so you're gonna get retaliated against. Even
That's why I was hoping that that action that the legislature took got some press coverage. And I thought, I want the VSEA employees to know that if they come to me, even if I don't make their name known at their request, because it's a small shop, somebody's going to know. But
Right.
if their boss knows that I'm paying attention, I think they're going to be less likely.
Right.
You know.
Did
You
you
would
get any
think so.
coverage on that? Probably.
Yeah, we did,
Did you?
yeah.
Oh, good.
Is this something that, sorry, not to deviate too much from but is this something that VSEA is looking at all? Because I would think that they'd have an interest in
They
making
do.
sure
They're
that
very concerned, but there's only so much they can do.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, I think historically, not just here, I think it goes with the territory, the Department of Human Resources represents the administration, technically, not the workers, although I could argue that they should represent everyone. I mean, they should be fair, period. There should be no favoritism of any kind, and I think many of their employees do their jobs by the book, right down the middle, and that's great.
Yes, they do.
However, it wouldn't surprise people to know that there were times when, at the request of supervisors and others, people who are whistleblowers end up being investigated. Because, you know, a supervisor said,
He's bad
they're
performance.
coming up
blah,
with
blah,
someone,
blah.
yeah, right.
Right. Yeah. They're trying to cover something or
Right.
whatever. Yeah.
We did an audit of the way the state deals with misconduct allegations. And there are two groups. One is at AHS because they have their own. They're so
Right.
big. The other is HR does the rest of state government. And as it turned out, there's a lot of room for improvement. But part of it is that after the investigation is done, then they send their findings up to the appointing authorities, so-called, for decision. Sometimes those decisions take a long time. As a result, some folks are out on relief from duty for a very long time.
You had an article in the paper, didn't you?
It was for an
about
audit
that?
we did. It was almost
Holy
$3
mackerel.
million.
Yeah.
We paid people not to work.
I know.
Now, some of that,
We should chat. This is really cool.
Oh gosh.
so
Oh,
anyway,
that's-
now, some of those are perfectly legitimate.
Right.
If there's an allegation of sexual harassment, they don't want you in the workplace
Right.
while it's being investigated.
Right.
But there's a motivation, there should be motivation to get through it,
Yeah,
get it done as
get it
quickly as
back.
you can. And if you're to be disciplined and booted, do it. If not, come back to work. We need you. We're
Right.
paying you anyway.
Right.
Right.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I remember one just hit my head. It was almost a year, and my department was paying money, and I'm like, could we move this up a little bit, speed
Right.
it up?
Give some
But they
incentive
didn't.
to speed it along.
Exactly.
You know, it doesn't because you can spend 2 or 3 weeks, even longer than that, on an investigation and get to the bottom of it. If it's sitting in a file somewhere and no one's even paying attention to it, that's not
Well,
really
because the
acceptable.
guy's getting paid, and he's happy, or he or she, and
or
Some-
not happy because they
sometimes-
don't know what's going to happen with their
Well,
job.
well,
Sometimes, as was pointed out, in fairness to HR, there are instances where the employee intentionally delays
right, right.
the process. Not all the time, but there's
It does.
room for
So,
improvement.
I wanted to also talk about, speaking of this website, you have, I think this is amazing, you've published a timetable of the work you're doing, work in progress, and then when it's due. I think that is excellent.
We don't always make those deadlines.
Well, that's okay, but there's an effort, and I think I kind of looked at some of the dates. I went, but
Yeah.
there's an effort of this is going to take 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever, and you give them a little bit of a timeline. I think that's great, and then a list of what you're doing. So
Well, I appreciate that you looked at that. I don't know that a lot of people do. The website's accessible. In fact, it's a little fun these days because there are some nice photos from sometimes
there are. It's
Vermont
very nice,
photographers and
yeah.
others. But yeah, I appreciate that.
I think the
We work hard
website
on
says
that.
a lot about a department and what you're willing to share and how easy it is to navigate. And so I always look at the websites.
I appreciate
anyway.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think on that theme, there's a whole bunch of you post all of your results, all of your audits on the website, and just a couple of them for this year are environmental compliance, state employee misconduct, and then the Department of Building and General Services, the BGS audit, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Do you mind talking a little bit about the environmental compliance and the state employee misconduct?
I mentioned
audits?
the misconduct one just
Yeah.
a moment ago, but the DEC, the Environmental Conservation Enforcement Audit, I was not happy with the headline that VT Digger put on that one.
Oh,
I
really?
love VT Digger, but I don't write the headlines. And they basically called them out for not enforcing the law, and that was a bit of an exaggeration. We looked at 4 programs within DEC, and there were many more than 4, and a couple of them could do a much better job in documenting what they do, which is complicated because some of them have different systems and there's not a lot of crosswalk. And that's true, frankly, just as an aside, in almost every job we find that there are problems with software. And not so much hardware, but software. Some of it's very old, like the so-called access system at the Agency of Human Services is 30 years old.
Which no one can access.
There's barely anybody who could fix it
Right.
now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's terrible. Anyway, so that's sometimes the problem. Sometimes it's they don't have adequate policies and procedures. Sometimes they don't have good training. For example, we've had audits where we're looking at a number of issues, and you have a big database. And if you look at it in an Excel spreadsheet, for example, there's 30 different columns. Each one of those is a field. Your name, your address, did you get some money?
Right.
Are there notes on what happened? Were you eligible? And things have to be coded. And there might be 10 different opportunities to code you for different things. If they're not trained properly, if they don't use the codes properly, then when we go in to pull the information out and get a report, we don't know if it's accurate, it's reliable. It's
Right.
really quite annoying. The other thing that DEC didn't do, which was really very curious, now understandably, and I think we would agree that this is the appropriate response, they don't want to just beat people over the head when they find there's been a violation. They want to do what's called, progressive, it's not like the misconduct thing where it's discipline, but they want to start with a conversation. Say, hey, did you know? You weren't in compliance with your permit, fix it. If it goes on for a while, they have other levers that they can
Right.
get to. Eventually, they can take them to court, they can fine them, they can make them pay to clean things up, all that stuff. But they don't do that very often. They try to avoid that, and I understand that. But what they didn't do, which was very curious, years ago, the legislature gave them the authority to say, if you have somebody who has been penalized and they have not paid you, but they've come in to renew their permit or get a new permit, you can say, not a chance until you pay.
Right.
And they never did that. And I don't know why.
Interesting.
What
This
a
has
great
been
time
through-
to
It's like the
collect.
one lever that they can pull, and
Yeah,
they
right.
don't pull
Exactly. And so this has been through several different commissioners. So I think they got that. They appreciate that. It is a useful leverage. And
Sure.
I wouldn't be surprised if they use it going forward.
That's great.
So.
I know there's a whole bunch of topics here. You were talking at once about healthcare price transparency, or lack thereof, I guess.
Yeah.
That's a huge issue, healthcare anyway. You must keep you busy 90% of your time.
It's a big one. This issue was really brought to me by the first guy who took this position in the office, the non-audit researcher, who's now at the tax department, former reporter, Andrew Stein was his name, and his beat was healthcare. So when he came in, we said, do you have any ideas, Andrew? Is there anything you'd like to work on? And this was one of half a dozen that he mentioned, and I got this right away. In what other aspect of your life do you go into what could be a major expenditure with no idea what it's going to cost?
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's outrageous.
Surprise.
It's outrageous. So we did this work, and as it turned out, the legislature, to its credit, almost 10 years ago, said to then BISCA, the Department of Banking, Insurance, and so forth, and then when they carved out healthcare and created the Green Mountain Care Board, they now have the responsibility for, among many other things, they have a full plate, for this question. They were told to do this. And just as an aside, when the report came out, the board basically said, yeah, they told us to do it, but they didn't say when, which
Right.
really
Yeah.
pissed
Oh
Or
my
how
God.
to how to do it.
pissed me off. So
Yeah.
anyway, Andrew
Really?
spent a lot of time on this, and it's obviously of interest, not just to individuals, but for example, if you're self-insured, like Vermont, although we have a union, more or less a union shop, so employees, they don't really care what things cost.
Right.
Because their contribution is
incentive.
modest.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but
Yeah.
if you're a private sector, non-union shop, you're wondering, how can I reduce my healthcare costs? Well, as it turns out, if you go to the hospital over here, the heart procedure costs $20,000. Over there, it costs $60.
Right.
Which one are we going to use?
Yeah.
Now, Vermont's tougher because it's small, and you don't want to put people in, even with non-emergency things, to drive 75 miles,
Right.
because then it's hard for the family to visit and so forth. But we actually collected some data, and it's all available in what's called VCures, which is a database, this massive database of every payment
What
made.
is that, VCures?
VHCURES.
I've never heard of that.
And it was set up almost 10 years ago, and now it's a tremendous tool that the board uses. But we said, New Hampshire and Maine and some other states are creating websites that allow you to say, okay, I'm a BCB as a Blue Cross subscriber. I'm going to go in and I need a colonoscopy. What's it going to cost me? And they'll know, because I'm a subscriber, what my deductible is and all that stuff. Bingo, and it comes up.
Yeah.
And what will it cost me there as opposed to there? Other states were trying to do that.
Oh.
And the board was not anxious to do it because it's expensive and it takes a little time, but it's now been several years and we're no closer to that goal. So what the legislature did in response to the board saying we don't want to do it, we don't have the resources, they said, well, fine, we're going to tell the insurers to do it. So Blue Cross and MVP have to have material on their website telling you, okay,
Really?
providers for that service at these various hospitals typically charge this. Now the problem is, one of the problems is, it was pointed out when the report came out, if you don't really reach out to people and tell them, hey, use this service, and if you need some help, we'll help you. They didn't do that. So not that many people are using it,
Not
but
really
Yeah.
supportive of it.
Right.
we're still interested. And I've
Right.
sent a letter to Kevin Mullen, who I'm sure you know,
Yep,
the new
right.
chair of the board, and he's interested, so we'll keep bugging him.
And
with
Mr.
that.
Pelham
Well, it's
just got
interesting.
appointed.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Your best friend. No.
Exactly. Healthcare.
It's interesting because I have actually been looking at this issue recently before we decided to have you on the show. And I was also struck by the fact that this is such a large expense for so many people that, and you do virtually know nothing about it before you go on what it's going to cost, what your expected outcomes are going to be,
Right.
what recovery is going to cost, all these things. And part of it's because you're one step removed typically if you're a commercial insurer, customer. And Vermont is one of 19 states that has a all-payer claims database, which is what Vermont Cures, VH Cures is.
Right.
But we're one of the only ones that doesn't post those things in an open way that people can search and say, if I'm looking for this procedure, here's my plan that I have, here's what it's going to cost me out of pocket, here's what the total bill is going to be.
There's been some research on this, quite a bit.
Yeah.
And the second report we did, Christoph, who took Andrew's position when Andrew left, updated some of that research and found some more recent stuff, and it all points to the same result.
Yeah.
If people are led to this information,
Right.
they
Well, they
will
need to
take
know it's there.
advantage of it and
Yeah.
save money.
Right.
And furthermore, if your hospital finds out that everybody's going to his hospital,
Competition.
it might mitigate.
Right.
And
Yeah.
furthermore, just to be clear, for those who pay attention to this, it's important to say that it's not just cost. Because some people think, oh, it's more expensive, it must be better. If I spend 50 grand for a BMW, it's got to be a better car than my little
Have they asked how
Datsun
many
over here.
patients they've lost?
Not quality and
right.
how often they've done the procedure. All this information has to be brought together.
Well, and another thing that that we were thinking about is what if it's not just quality and cost, but also time. So if you're going to walk-in care clinic, for example,
Right.
you want to know what the wait time is going to be. Because if you go to Fletcher Allen,
That's right.
you could be sitting there for 3 or 4 hours before they even look at you.
You might wait 3 or 4 months before you can get an appointment.
Exactly.
Or you get an
Well,
appointment.
that's another
But
thing.
if you had one place you can go that you can see, here's the cost, here's the quality outcomes, so here's the rate, and here's maybe what the time is to get in. If you're, great example, in the Fletcher Allen example where it's going to be a 4-hour wait time, I could drive up to Northwestern
That's right.
in 45
Treated
minutes, and if there's
well.
no wait there,
You could be home before.
I could
Yeah,
be
right,
home
right.
before I could get in.
That's right.
And so if you had that information at your fingertips,
Exactly.
what kind of decisions could you make? And the other added benefit is, hospitals and emergency services, they have to staff for the most amount of volume they might see.
Right.
If you can distribute that volume by people making different decisions, you don't have to have the highest level
Yeah,
of,
little
of
savings.
readiness.
True.
Right.
Yep. So we have about 3.5 minutes. Just quickly, were you
Have your
involved
own
at
mugs,
all,
that's cool.
at all in the EB5 record and the Governor Shumlin's decision to withhold some records or whatever his decision was?
No.
Did you weigh in on that one? I thought that was interesting.
I didn't.
Is that a
What
good word?
I wasn't asked.
Yeah.
By statute, my office has access to everything.
Right.
What happens is, in some cases, for example, in the tax department, it's understood up front, although we sign a memorandum of understanding anyway, that some information can't be made public.
Right.
We have to find a way to tell the story of the audit without identifying individual taxpayers, which is fine. And when we do Medicaid-related audits, we get into personal health care records,
Right.
the sex offender register, all this
All
stuff.
right.
So we deal with confidential information all the time. That itself is not a problem. What happened here is very different.
I
The
found
the
it
litigation
I don't even know
hold
what he was basing that decision on. though.
was strange.
Yeah.
I don't know. It wasn't T.J. Donovan. It was his predecessor, although they have continued in this regard, and there's still outstanding litigation. Typically, we don't do audits as a rule when something is in litigation.
Oh, I see.
Because, first of all, it's disruptive of their process because, we are disruptive. We go into your office
Right.
and we need to sit
Yes,
down.
I've
we
been
need-
through one of those.
We need time and access to records and so
Right.
forth. So, but as to your question, I have not been directly involved. I am actually having conversations with people about the possibility of getting involved.
Good.
We'll see how it goes. There, clearly, between the SEC and the federal courts and maybe the state courts, there will be a legal
Right.
process that
Right.
will run its course.
Right.
I think what people are wondering about at this point is not about that part, which is going to be resolved one way or the other. It's about the role and responsibilities and actions of state employees.
Right. Well, and there's this whole thing with the emails, right? And what email
Well, that's what he said.
emails were public and which ones weren't, and
Yeah.
and there's a lot of questions still to be answered.
I'm so glad they finally answered that question, may I say, working in
Oh,
state
the court,
government.
you mean? Yeah.
I always thought if I had a memo on my private computer, it's yours.
Yeah.
Too bad for me.
Yeah,
Here's my
it's
computer, take it. I
Such
never
a clear,
understood that.
Yeah, it's such a clear work around the public records.
Yeah.
But at least they said it's a public record, but we're not, in effect, authorizing people to come to your home and take your
No,
computer.
and that I just figured, here, take it, whoever's doing the research, because it's my choice to use, it's just the computer. It doesn't change the document.
No.
Document's confidential or whatever, state property.
And,
I agree, that was a good decision.
Yeah.
and my understanding is that the AG's office is the one that gets to decide what is the public record and what's not when they're looking at a private email account. Is that correct, or how does that work?
Not necessarily. The governor's office, for example, has counsel that is separate from the Attorney
Right,
General's
that's for
office.
his.
And in fact, there are over 200 attorneys in state government. Not all of them work for the Attorney General. Some are general counsel in the departments in which they're embedded, although I think they're moving to bring them all
Yeah,
under
most
the
of
AG's
them
house.
are under the AG's office.
But that's not always the case. It's not always the AG's call.
So it's whatever
it's a mixed
the
bag.
relevant attorney is for that department.
And I can tell you, we've actually, I know you're running out of time, so
Yeah, I
maybe
just
I'll
wanted-
let it go. That's all right.
Did we forget to ask you anything that people would be interested in? Because
How would I know? I think you did a great
all I
job.
can tell you is check out the website. Every single thing has got a link to it, and you can just follow it right through. I'm going to check the recommendations.
Well, this has been
That's a
fun.
good thing.
Thanks so much. I
That's
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Good to meet you.
Thanks for tuning in.
And you as well.
Thank you for
My
coming
pleasure.
on. And we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.